Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. This is the first time that I've ever done anything like this before, so it's a heck of an experience for me. But a little bit about me, I guess the important thing would be to kind of start at the beginning of where I came in the theological world. Was my mother was Catholic, and after a divorce, these things happen. We converted to being Lutheran, and I grew up my whole life Lutheran. Being in the choir, singing in the choir, playing the trumpet in church. All of those, all of the things that you do when you grow up with a good Christian upbringing. I got a little bit older, and when I went off into the army, and that's when I think doubt started to come into the picture. I got stationed at Guantanamo Bay Naval Station in '94, late '94, and that was back when you had the situation where there were a lot of Cubans and Haitians that were jumping on board rafts to to escape to to the United States. They were doing through the Straits of Florida and all that stuff. And when you read, or not read, but when you talk to kids that that are coming off of the Coast Guard cutters. 6-year-old kids, 4-year-old kids, 5-year-old kids, and they're telling you stories about, how mom and dad got eaten by sharks, right in front of their eyes, right before the Coast Guard cutter came and scooped them up. And when you hear those stories, naturally your heart breaks, and you begin, where's God? Why this? Why this poor little kid? And those poor kids that are born with cleft lips and have heart palpitations and all these things, and you're like, why do these things happen? So, I began to be a pretty significant doubter, and kind of walked away from church. Didn't go to church anymore, and right up until my son was born. I have 3 kids. I have a 12-year-old boy, a 10-year-old girl, and a 2-year-old little boy, and they're they're great, and their mom is awesome as well. And but when my first son was born, something happens to you when you become a father. If you have any kind of a heart, something happens to you. And when I looked into his eyes the first time, and you had that look back, and I held him, I knew. I said, this is love. There's something there's something greater than the rest of us. So it ended up coming down to, well, we need to raise him and our other kids up with a religion. And I had always, I had grown up Christian, like I said before, but my wife, her father is Jewish, and her mother was a Mormon. So that in itself being, the completely different spectrums of religion to begin with, but
Quite the mix.
she wasn't raised with any of it.
Right.
They decided not to raise them with religion, and although they celebrated, holidays, they celebrated the secular Christmas and Easter, but nobody, she was never raised that way. So here I was, trying to explain, the doctrines of original sin and predestination and the Trinity and all this stuff to somebody who was an adult. And how do you rationally explain those types of things to somebody who had never grown up with it? And I began to realize that there's a reason why they call it a childlike faith. You're young. It starts as a small child. It's kind of you're read it, and you're told this is the way you have to believe, and eventually you become an adult that views it as a reality. And and not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, because a lot of Christian people do wonderful things, but I had a hard time. So when I couldn't explain it and make sense of it, I began to be more of a doubter. So I started to look at other things, because I knew there was something. So then I started looking at deism, and as any good deist will tell you, the quote unquote Bible that a deist uses, The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, which is, I don't know if you've read it,
Sure.
but it's a tough read for somebody who gives credible authority to the Bible, because he's very, very he takes the Bible and uses it against itself, where it shows the Bible has certain contradictions in it, and it has things, as far as, infanticide and genocide and things like that are just tough things to grasp, like the flood, for example. Who can possibly believe that the same God who loves us and created us in His image decided to wipe every man, woman, child, cat, dog, salamander, everything, wipe everything out because of the actions of of the few. It's kind of like what you see. What happens now is we as a people kind of like to condemn the Muslim faith because of the actions of a few. So, I ended up, getting very critical of the Bible and organized religion, and then I became a Freemason. And ironically, people, the organized church specifically, has an issue with Freemasons because they view Freemasonry as a religion or something like that. And if anything brought me back into reading the Bible, it was Masonry, because it's considered one of the great lights. That's the ultimate source of wisdom. So here I was, a Freemason, reading the Bible, somebody who's somewhat skeptical of the Bible, reading the Bible, and I was like, I have to figure this thing out for myself. So I did what you're supposed to do with a book, right? You start at page 1, and you read it all the way to the end. A lot of people, they talk about how much they study the Bible and how they're experts on the Bible, and they can't tell you what happens in the book of Joel, or they can't tell you what happens, in the book of Habakkuk or Obadiah. They probably don't even know that they're biblical books, but they can't tell you those stories. They can tell you certain passages that you read about, in Paul or Peter and stuff like that, but they can't tell you the general context of the story. So I started from the beginning and the end, and I read it in the King James Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, the RSV, and the NIV. I used those 5, and then I ended up saying, well, there has to be, what about the Jewish side? Because if anybody knows the Old Testament, it would be the Jews. They did write it. So I grabbed an Art Scroll Tanakh and a Jewish Publication Society Tanakh, and I started studying that. So you have, a very liberal Reform methodology to it, and then you have a very Orthodox methodology to it. And I began to see that, there's a lot of differences between the way the Jewish people and religion focused on their scriptures versus what, you're raised as a Christian to believe. Certain things in Isaiah and the Psalms that a lot of folks point to as messianic prophecies were actually prophecies, but if you read the next chapter, they were fulfilled. And I think that a lot of folks, the beautiful thing about the Bible is the same thing that's the most dangerous thing about the Bible, is when it's in a certain person's hands, it can be very powerful in a good way, and it can be very dangerous in a bad way. And in the Bible you have concepts like love thy neighbor and loving God, but then you also have slaves being obedient to their masters, and people being subservient to the state, and women not being allowed to speak in church, and you have there's these wide spectrums of things. And I think that ultimately that the Bible could be viewed as maybe our own story too. I'm not somebody that takes everything in the Bible as literal truths. I think that you have to, go and read it in layers and try to personalize it. First of all, I mean, when you look at all the if you go back in history and you read about the the teachers of the ancient Near East and all the great philosophers, they always spoke in parables, and they always spoke using hyperbole and all these types of things. So and that was because of the simplicity of the mind at the time. So when you have that, and then you have who the focus of the Christian faith, who is Jesus, who never taught straight. He didn't never say 1 + 1 = 2. He said, you have one apple, and then one day you walk down the road and you found another apple, and then you walk down the road a little further and realized that you had 2 apples. It was parables, and it was never, and it was done that way because that's just the way that they taught, and they use symbolism and they use parables and this and this. So in order for somebody to really, study the Bible, they have to maybe consider the fact that, it doesn't have to be literally true to be relevant. You know, there's messages that are within it. There's underlying themes that are within it. And one of the things I like to do is I like to say, look, you know, the Bible is kind of my story too. You know, I had my beginning. I had my trials and my tribulations, and you know, my times of conquest, like Joshua, you know, with the Canaanites. And then I had my suffering. I had my screw ups, like David, greatest king in Israel's history. But he was weak in the flesh. You know, he had, you know, he lusted for other women and took wives that didn't belong to him. And then you had Solomon, you know, the biggest playboy of the Old Testament, you know, with 300 wives and 700 concubines, or vice versa, whatever it was, you know. But whatever, you know, when you look at that, you tend to wonder, well, you know, did the Torah, as we talk about it now, exist during the time of Solomon's temple? Did the Ten Commandments, you know, the Decalogue, actually exist during the time of the Ten Commandments? Sorry about that, I have a pop-up. Sorry. Right. You know, during the time of the Ten Commandments, because clearly that whole adultery thing didn't seem to apply to Solomon, you know, unless he was, you know, above the law. So, but anyway, I kind of went on a tangent. But, you know, I think that when people take the text overly literal, you know, it can tend to be somewhat of a problem. But one of the things that you know, that I like to do is I like to, you know, I talk to my children about it. Both of my kids, they understand the Bible, they understand other religions, you know, as well. They both have their own, and we sit down and we read. My daughter really likes the book of Daniel because she likes Daniel in the lion's den, and you know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, reading about you know, the walking around in the oven and everything being fine. But I think that she views them the same way that she views Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. You know, they're stories, and I think that that's what a lot of this is. And you know, and what we have now is we have, you know, an organized Christian church that, you know, preaches a lot of dogmas and doctrines that don't even, you know, that you really can't even trace back, you know, to the Bible itself. I don't believe that the same God that gave me the breath of life and gave me the blessing of being able to be a father is going to condemn me to hell because I don't believe what somebody says I'm supposed to believe. I don't even believe in hell. You know, I think that you know, that Satan is properly portrayed as a servant of God in the book of Job, where he's, you know, subservient. He's not superior. He doesn't have control over us. I think what you have is the Jewish and Kabbalistic concept of Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Hatov. People have seen this concept where you have, you know, a little angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other shoulder, and the angel's telling you, you got to do it this way, and the devil's saying, no, you can do it this way, and then you are ultimately the one that has to make the decision and has to make the choice, and I think that that's the concept. You know, we both, you know, we have both, and then we have to take what, you know, what we learn, and you know, and what we're raised with in our morals to, you know, to lead the good life. But, you know, and then what you have left is you have an organized church that wants to control the way people think. And I know that, you know, I've got a lot of friends out there that are going to get upset with me for saying this, but it is. A lot of it is control. And if you don't think it's control, what was so dangerous about this book? You know, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. If you guys recall, when this book came out in the beginning, the church condemned it. Sure. You know, they didn't want the children to buy it. It was such a horrible thing. It turned into being pretty much the same doggone story that you hear in the Bible. You have good, you have evil. Good wins over evil. And then an even worse book was this one. You know, was the Da Vinci Code. This one really, you know, raised a lot of feathers. Well, sure. Why? Especially you know, because it caused doubt in this. You know, I don't understand. You know, they both say that they're fiction. So why would fiction, blatant fiction, be a problem to somebody's faith? You know, or be a so if people are so worried that they can lose faith because they believe because of a story about a boy wizard and a serpent-like, you know, evil guy, then there's something wrong with what the pastor's probably preaching in the pulpit on Sunday. You know, and I think that, you know, ultimately when you look at that, yeah, it's control, you know, and it was very clear, you know, during the times of Martin Luther with the, you know, with the indulgences that they were selling. You know, you could buy, you know, 50 years off of purgatory, and I mean all this silly stuff that really happened that nobody seems to remember. You know, but I think that when you pull all those things away, and when you just get back to the good stuff, where two or three are gathered in my name, I will dwell among them. I think that ultimately is what's important. When you get people of like minds sitting down, going over what Scripture is and what it really means to them, I think that is when you see the value in it, not when somebody's standing up in front of 5,000 people trying to tell you what it means, when that's their particular perspective. So I may have rambled. I have a tendency to go in circles sometimes, but I guess that's my opening monologue for your for your show.
I tell you, I really enjoy your fire, and I think others will also. I want you to continue tonight to simply expose what you think to be true. In other words, we are here to make sure that we have people putting things on the table of discussion. We're interested in intellectual honesty, spiritual honesty, and scriptural honesty. So let's deal with some of the things that you've talked about. For instance, when you go back into the Old Testament and we deal with various stories, and it depends on which book you read, which translation that you read.
Right.
When you get past the translation models, and all translation models, that is extant translation models of the Old Testament and even the New Testament, are all extremely synthetic, first of all. But when you deal with the Old Testament, that is the Hebrew, we call it First and Second Temple Hebrew, we have to admit what the text is. The text is simply an abjad. It's a consonantal text. It's a nominal text. It's something that the reader can never know what each author ever intended. It's impossible. What the authors intended out of each and every book of the Old Testament is simply something that is a guessing game, because you can supply any variations of vowels, and this has been done throughout the centuries. And the Jews essentially looked at this abjad, this creative writing system that is just supplying consonants, with allowing the readers simply to put what they wanted to these consonants, and this allowed a creative process in which we did have this extreme hyperbole, as you were talking about earlier. And out of that, we have thousands of different stories that come from the same text, even the same passages. And so to isolate it and call it an accuracy or an accurate text would be extremely wrong.
Right.
But on the other side of the fence, it is enjoyable to pick up Harry Potter and read Harry Potter and see the good and the bad and the ugly of everything going on, and call it fiction. And so I guess my point and possibly my question is, if we examine the Scripture for what it is that important to do before we take it any further, that is, into the interpretive state?
I think that it is. I mean, it's no less a phenomenon to think about the fact that we have a text, whether true or not, that has stood for centuries, and people have pored over the text, studied it, tried to emulate it. So I think that there's definitely some value to it, but I think that people need to look at it with their own lens, and that they need to study it in their own, with their own life. Because I think that for biblical study to be relevant and for it to actually be valuable, one has to read the text and insert themselves into the text. And you can't do this with some of the things. I mean, the whole nonsense with Elisha calling down the bears to maul the children, that's in it's in Chronicles or something. I can't remember which one it is. It's an Old Testament book where Elisha calls down the bears and they maul the children because they were calling him a bald man. I mean, there's no value to that. But I think when you read a lot of the Psalms, specifically Psalm 51, where is there a better psalm or prayer when you screw up, than Psalm 51? Is there any better source of comfort when you're feeling alone than Psalm 23? And then if anybody who's versed in the Apocrypha, there's the prayer of Manasseh, which is a beautiful prayer, that I just recently discovered and blogged about, well, and that's kind of what I've been doing with the blog. It's not me preaching, because first of all, I don't want anybody to even come up with the concept that I am a know-it-all, because I don't know any of it. I just read it and I try to figure it out for myself. And I'm open to the fact that, number one, I have to question with boldness even the existence of God, just like Thomas Jefferson said, because we wouldn't want us to suspend our reason, to believe in, that same creative and perpetual force. But I think at the same time, we have to, for thousands of years, people have been trying to understand the unknowable, have been trying to understand those things that can't be explained. Up until, recent science, the idea that God was angry and he shook the earth. Well, now we know that's really plate tectonics, and the plates are moving and rubbing against each other, and that's what causes the earthquake. Is it caused by God? Well, it's very likely, but not in the same context that people probably think. I don't think that, Pat Robertson was right about his, what he said about earthquakes and tsunamis. I think that kind of stuff is just total nonsense. But I think when people take it and they try to, to personalize the text, then they can, I think they get value of it. And I think probably the best person in the Bible, there's a couple. I mean, Joseph is a phenomenal person to try to insert yourself into the life of Joseph, try to insert yourself into the life of David, because I think all of us have done, the chaste things that Joseph did and some of the not so chaste things that David did. But I think the best example would be Jesus, not to get overly evangelical or anything like that. But I mean, is there a better example of charity? Is there a better example of unjudgmentalness? Is there a better example of love? I don't think so. And I think that when people try to insert themselves into that character and try to emulate that character, could you imagine if the world was full of a bunch of Jesuses? You wouldn't have, marketplaces being blown up because of the crazy ideologies. And I think that that's another thing that people have to consider, is that, while we may view the Bible as being a definitive source, others won't. And I have a book over here with my Masonic friends will love this. This is Morals and Dogma. It was written by Albert Pike, and it was just recently adapted and updated by Arturo de Hoyos of the Scottish Rite. And basically what people that aren't Masons don't understand is that these 33 degrees that people talk about, and how it's this Luciferian theology, it's actually total nonsense. That's not what it is. Each one of the degrees is emblematic of a different perspective of religion. So Morals and Dogma, the book that I just showed you, is probably one of the finest pieces of literature when it comes to comparative religious studies. Because what you do is you take the best of Zoroastrianism, you take the best of the Mithraic faith, you take the best of the Egyptian mythologies, you take the best of Hellenism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. There is some good to Islam. You take, all of these different religions and you put them, and you strip the dogmas off, okay? And you strip all of the, the judgmental proselytizing things where you have to believe a certain way or you're going to die and roast in some make-believe hell. When you take those things away, then you have the beauty of what these things are, and then you have what's called an ice cream god. You have, and I think that's, my personal view is, you could say ice cream, you could say, God's a mountain, many paths to the mountain. I say God's ice cream. You have chocolate, which is, you have strawberry, you have vanilla, you have butter pecan, all these different flavors, which are the different religions, but still ice cream. It's still people trying to understand those things that they don't know, okay, and that they don't understand. And hopefully the reason why they're trying to understand it is not so that they gain some kind of an upper hand or power over somebody else, but it's so that maybe they make themselves into a better person. Maybe they help the world around them. And as far as, when people have issues with, why would God allow the famines and the starvation that you see in Africa? And what I say is he's not, because we are. All right, we, the people that are in the more developed countries, and and look at not to pick on the Roman Catholics, but look at the way the Pope lives. He's in these silk gowns, he's got gold scepters, he's sitting on a gold throne like he's the king of the world, and you've got these poor kids over in Africa that are starving to death. We have the means so that not a single
Sure.
person on this planet could go starving, not a single child can go without health care, without food, without education. We have the resources on this planet, but we squander them amongst ourselves. You see the fight that goes on. There's some relevance to both what the Tea Party and our country are saying, and the occupiers. They have the same problem. They just don't realize that they have the same problem because they're looking at it from a different lens. And it's all goes down to that same concept of love thy neighbor as thyself. You don't want to go hungry. Well, why would you want your neighbor to go hungry? You don't want somebody to break into your house. So why would you just sit back and let somebody else do it, or act like it's not your problem? So I think that when people try to turn the world into being about me instead of being about we, I think that's when you have the problems that you have today, where people are just so closed-hearted to loving thy neighbor and everybody else. I think I answered the question, but I may have created additional ones. So feel free to to fire away whatever you have.
Let's do this. We are talking with Nelson Rose. He's a fantastic individual. He's putting some things on the table of discussion, and this is what we're here for. We want atheists, agnostics, Gnostics, theists of various kinds to come to the table of discussion. This is not a place to come where we're just going to listen to one thing. We want to listen to everything. And one of the things that I do enjoy about Nelson, he wants to put it all on the table and examine it all. He's not interested in just Judaism or Christianity. He wants to look at all different kinds of things that have been written throughout history and actually see if it's possible that maybe God did say something to this person or that person, possibly from another faith. Would you please give us your blog site? You're a blogger, an excellent one at that, and let's see if we can push that for a few minutes. Would you give us some data, please?
Okay, it's www.quest4light.com, and I started it probably about 14 months ago. And the way the blog started was I had a hard time writing a book. It's you want to chapter one. Okay, well here we go. I have to come. How long is a chapter? How many words? And how many chapters do I need in a book? And what's too long of a book? So I said, you know what? Let me just go with the blog. That's what everybody's doing now. And so I started with it. And the whole intent of the blog is exactly what the title is. It's the quest for light. I don't pretend to have the light, and I don't pretend to know exactly what the light might be. So I'm looking for it. And it's very heavy on the biblical side because I just think that that's an authoritative text. But I do read the Zohar a lot to my Kabbalist friends. I think it's a fantastic read. Anybody that hasn't read it, first of all, you have to make sure you're of mystical mind, otherwise you're not going to be able to handle it. So I read that. I read Morals and Dogma, which is the book that I showed you before, Albert Pike. And I do like to read the rabbinical commentaries to the Torah because I think that you have a writing that people have been trying to make sense of for many, many years. So that's what I blog about. So sometimes the blog could be very heavy on the Torah, and looking at those particular commentaries. Sometimes it'll be heavy on the Zohar and the Kabbalah, and sometimes Christianity. And that's because that's this ping pong game that's going on in my head right now anyways. I'm constantly trying to figure out, what the answers might be, or And I think when ultimately when you continue to read and go further and further into the text, you start to learn something like, well, you know what? I read this and I could have swore it sounds a whole lot similar to something that I read over here. And so that's where it becomes exciting and it becomes interesting. And I try to I try to kind of just share the things that I'm reading and the things that I'm learning. And a lot of times, you know, I get my daughter's walking by. A lot of times I get the comments from other bloggers or from you know, people that go to church. And for me, when the moment I realized that I was probably onto something with the blog was when I had a number of atheists telling me, hey, you know, I could go with this kind of theism, you know, the I'm not a know-it-all theism, and that maybe there's more to life and everything than just having to be a strict, rigid type of thing. And so the light bulb went off. Say, hey, maybe I'm onto something. But then when I got the hate emails from some of the
church people,
ministers in the South of a certain
so you get those, huh?
That's when I realized maybe I'm really onto something.
Don't feel lonely.
They're not happy.
Since we're talking about hate mail, maybe this is the best time to bring up this question, and this was not posed by me. It was posed by one in our audience. What are your views on gays? What is your view on gays?
I don't have a problem with it. I think that's an individual's, that's their lifestyle, and I don't have a problem with it. I'm for, you know, same-sex marriages as well. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that I have the right to tell somebody else the way they live their life and what they can or can't do with their own bodies.
You know, Dr. Ann Nyland just came out with a recent translation of both, of the scripture. Mm-hmm. Not all of it, but some of it. And one of the things that she's being really dogged about is her translation doesn't really address homosexuality. But as a translator and linguist, I can say with certainty that the Old and the New Covenant both never addressed homosexuality at all. But unfortunately, it seems as if the church created this mindset concerning the homosexual issues, and it became, you know, a very hot topic, so to speak. And so, you know, we've had a lot of condemnation. And it, you know, I think the better question would be, rather than talking about whether being a homosexual or heterosexual is right or wrong, I think the better question would be, why can't we deal with the problems of the heterosexual community and also the homosexual community? And I think that both communities are having difficulties dealing with their own problems, because the problems within the heterosexual community are huge. I mean, we've got all kinds of problems in both communities, and for some reason I think that people are looking to condemn people rather than dealing with our own problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people like to attack people for having their problems. I guess it's kind of a deflection of focusing on maybe things that they need to correct with themselves, like maybe being a little bit more tolerant and minding your own business. Because I think that, you know, people should be allowed to live the way, I mean, it doesn't hurt me. You know, it doesn't affect, you know, my relationship. It doesn't affect my marriage. So why should I tell anybody what they can or can't do? And to your point, what if it's a sin? All right. Well, so is wearing those little crosses that people like to wear all the time, because it's a violation of the second commandment. Thou shalt not, you know, make any graven images. So people walk around with these crosses. They have these tremendously big edifices of St. Mark, St. Matthew, you know, these are things, and people pray to them, you know. So that sin is no different than, you know, quote unquote, the sin of somebody being gay. The fact that you pick up a shovel after sundown on Friday night, or you're cutting your grass on Saturday morning, you've now violated the Sabbath. So you're going to advocate somebody going out and stoning you in the middle of 19th Street because you decided to cut your grass on Saturday morning? No. And I think the whole idea that people want to, it's an abomination of the gay community. Mind your own business and let them live their own lives. It's ridiculous and homophobic, and I think that it's a discussion that's gone on way too long, especially in politics, because I don't understand why it's even a political discussion, to be totally honest with you.
Let's talk about
the violation of the sanctity of marriage. That's hysterical. I mean, you have people that are married 4, 5, and 6 times. That's the violation of the sanctity of marriage, when you can't even stay married to one person, or when you're screwing around with somebody on the side. And the institution of marriage, well, that changed when they stopped trading your daughters in for goats and a bottle of milk. So that's everything's changed. You know what I mean? And I think the fact that that we have, as people, have to continue to evolve, with the times, and that's just one of those things. We got to be more tolerant of each other.
Let's talk about atonement. This has been a hot topic on our wall.
Yeah. Especially on your Facebook page.
Right. I mean, people become extremely polemic when it comes to this. But let's deal with it a bit.
Okay.
I contend that if you take the creative processes, that is, I look simply at the abjad, the writing system of the Old Covenant, simply like abstract art. You can't get any more out of it than abstract art. It's simply something that you look at, and whatever kind of conclusion that you want to draw, that's fine and it's fair. Mm-hmm. But there's something tragic that the church did. They took a couple of those interpretations of the abjad, that is from the Old Covenant, and they interpolated it into the Greek text, or the mindset of the Greek text, and now we have it, unfortunately, in the English text. And so when you read the New Testament, it's full of the doctrines of atonement and propitiation, that is, Jesus coming along to satisfy this bloodthirsty forgiver called his Father.
Right.
And so what do you really think about Jesus dying and shedding his blood in order to satisfy God, that is, so he might do something good for someone else?
I think that the idea that God is incapable of forgiving anybody without a blood sacrifice is utter nonsense.
Thank God.
I completely disagree with that entirely. How can there be an almighty Abba Father? How can there be, the benevolent, loving God when he's going to condemn people to hell just because, they, like I said, cut their grass on Saturday morning? I mean, technically, that's the concept, right? You break one little rule, and you suffer forever, unless you believe that this, that Jesus died. So what does Jesus' death mean to me? I think that a critical examination of what goes on in John 1:1, where it talks about the Word becoming flesh, I look at it at a completely different way than what other people think. I think what you have is you have a God that loves us, unconditionally loves us, just like I love my children, and you love yours. And I think that what you have is, God, Jesus is the embodiment of love. He's the embodiment of the law. So you have somebody who lived the law, and who lived with love, and who was killed for it. And then what does God do? He says, fine, go ahead and try to kill the law and try to kill the love. But I'm going to go ahead and raise it from the dead and throw it right back at you. And I think that's what you have. I think you have, with Jesus, you have somebody who is the embodiment of who we should strive to be, the ultimate lover, the ultimate, charitable, person, and he, not only do you have that, but you also have, somebody who shows you, what is love, the ultimate source of love, to the fact that you'd be willing to lay your life down for somebody that you love. I mean, there's no better, example of that. And I think that that's, to me, is what he is. So I look at Jesus as hey, this is that moral standard bearer that we should all strive to be. Did he have to die to save us? Well, this is my question to the people that subscribe to that kind of theology. Explain to me how a guy like Jerry Sandusky, who's Catholic, clearly believes in Jesus, is more deserving going to heaven than a very good friend of mine who's an atheist, who gives thousands to charities, constantly helps people out, gives free legal advice because he's an attorney, does these wonderful things and helps people out, but he doesn't believe the same thing that I believe. So he's in his 50s now. So let's say, God forbid, he dies tomorrow. He's going to be punished for eons and eons and eons and eons because of 5 decades of unbelief on the planet now? No, I don't believe that. It doesn't make rational sense to me, and I never will. So is God loving? Yes. Does God want to destroy the world? No. And that's where I am with it.
Nelson, do you believe that Jesus is very God himself?
No. I'm very Unitarian in my view of Jesus. I think that there's a lot that you can see where there's many occasions where Peter and Paul and even in the Gospels themselves and even Jesus himself talking about the Father being greater than he. Clearly the Father is God, Jesus being the instrument of God. Now, just because, sorry, I had that pop up again. Just because I don't consider Jesus God the Son, that doesn't mean I don't believe that he is the Son of God. But in the same context as all of us are being sons and daughters of God. But I think that we were given this example to live. But the deity of Jesus, no. But the divinity, yes. If that makes sense.
When you look at what Jesus accomplished, that is, in revealing what love is, if Paul is right, that love doesn't keep a record of wrongs, how can people reconcile that love doesn't keep a record of wrongs? And if it's also true that God is love, how can we reconcile that God would ever take us to court and we needed sweet Jesus as our lawyer to take us to court?
Yeah, so now you get into John's dream at Patmos, right? With Revelation and this apocalyptic opening of the skies and stars falling down and Judgment Day. I think that John's dream was a dream, but that's one of those things where I wish I knew. As far as life after death, I like to believe that yeah, maybe there is something afterwards, but I don't know about you. I haven't met anybody that's died, and come back and told me what it is on the other side. So I think what the Bible teaches and what Jesus teaches is hope. Hope that maybe there is something better on the horizon. But I don't think that. Could you imagine that trial? Billions and billions of people waiting in the courtroom, to go up in front of the Almighty Judge, and you have the prosecutor being the fallen angel, Satan, and then you have the defense attorney, being Jesus. That would take eons itself, to happen. But I don't know. I mean, is it possible that the skies will open up one day and Judgment Day will happen? I don't put it past the Creator to do anything. But
I guess my question is there a bit of contradiction to saying love doesn't keep a record of wrongs, and yet at the same time love does keep a record of wrongs. In other words, if God actually is love,
Mm-hmm.
and if he keeps a record of wrongs, yet he claims that love doesn't keep a record of wrongs, doesn't that create this tension or contradiction?
Yeah, of course it does. Because it's either love or it's not. You know, it's either, well, I guess one could say, well, there's multiple types of love. You have unconditional love, and then you have love that has strings attached. You know, and I think that the Almighty Creator and Sovereign of the universe is a little bit above love with strings attached. That's my opinion. I think greater things of him than that.
Do you think that God is above forgiveness? By that I mean, if love does not keep a record of wrongs, and God certainly loves us unconditionally, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what would he have to forgive us about?
I don't see, and that's the thing is I think that the idea God's probably already forgiven you for things that you haven't even done yet. You know, it's just like as being a parent. You know, and you have your child and they do something wrong and you say, hey, no, you shouldn't do that. And do I remember that forever? No, it's over right there at that moment. Something happens, you know, and that's it. You know, but
Well, I mean, you would
no,
have to resent
I don't
your
think
child.
he keeps a record.
No,
You know?
well, I don't believe he even is. You know, I think he's beyond forgiveness. I mean, with our children, I can't say that I've ever resented them, had a grudge against them. You know, to me that is, and maybe I'm trying to, you know, humanize forgiveness. But
I see where you're getting
You see what
at.
I'm saying? I mean,
yeah, no,
I just don't
think
believe
that the
God is
concept-
that way. He's better than that. He's better than
Of course he's
forgiveness.
better than that. It's
Yeah.
about us acknowledging the fact that we screwed up, okay? And wanting to be better people, not about whether he can forgive us or not. That part of it's already done. It's us trying to be better people. It's us acknowledging the fact that, hey, we made a mistake. Hey, God, I'm sorry. You know, and even more important than that is for the people that may have done something to you and have wronged you in some kind of a way, you have to be able to forgive them, because how could you possibly, you know, expect it in return, even though you get it in return? I think that the concept of forgiveness is more about our forgiving of other people and our acknowledging our own faults and fessing up to them and trying to eliminate them. I think it's more about that than it is about God actually forgiving.
Right,
Well,
because we're human, and you know we can hold grudges. Now I'm not saying I've never held a grudge. I've never held one against my children, and I've
Right.
never resented my children. And so, you know, other people possibly. I'm trying to live a life where I'm above forgiveness too. And one of these days, I hope to, you know, attain that goal of not having to forgive, because then I haven't held something against somebody.
Right,
And-
and it's hard too, because you know the worst that somebody, you know, people can do, they can cheat you, they can cheat on you, you know, and that's a tough thing to just kind of say, you know, I'll act like it didn't happen. And I think that maybe that, you know, all of that stuff that's written is more along that lines than it is, you know, along being forgiven, you know,
Right.
by, you know,
Sure.
by God. You know what I mean? So I'm agreeing with you, but I think,
Right,
you
I
know,
know what you're
that
saying.
there's a reason for the story, and I think it's more along our doing the forgiving.
Well, let's see if we can frame this a little bit in a particular manner. For instance, the Mayo Clinic writers have written much about forgiveness, and I think that most professionals in the business of dealing with people who have mental problems, dealing with people who have emotional problems, and just problems at large.
Mm-hmm.
The Mayo Clinic writers have written much about forgiveness in this kind of context. Forgiving is when a person gets rid of their grudges, gets rid of that resentment, gets rid of those things that they've held against another. In other words, forgiving indicates that you're getting rid of those flaws in your life. It's, in other words, the one who is doing The forgiving is the one who's getting rid of some problems. And I think that what my wife is suggesting is that God doesn't have that kind of problem.
Right.
Now, we have problems. We certainly, as human beings, do. We have the propensity sometimes to resent our children, and the propensity also to keep a record of wrongs, etc. But God doesn't. He's above all of that.
Right.
That's why when we read the Greek text, it's fascinating that aphe, inflected aphemi, excuse me. If we look at either inflection, we will find that what the writers are saying, for instance, when Jesus said, he didn't say, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. It would be better to say, Father, help them. His interest was not in saying, Father, you need to get rid of your grudges. You need to get rid of those things that you're holding against your people. That's not what he was talking about. He's simply saying, Father, you need to take the weight off of them. You know, they're heavy laden. You know, Jesus put it this way. He said, all of you guys who are heavy laden, come unto me and I will give you rest. And the whole idea of aphe in Greek simply means to take the load off of us, take those things that weight us down. It's not an issue of forgiveness at all. It's actually the lifting of all of that pressure off of us. In other words, my wife and I are attempting to practice this. We want to rise above what forgiveness is. We don't want to resent our kids, because I don't think that good parents resent their children.
I don't resent my children.
And
I
so,
don't resent my kids. I love my kids.
That's
They're
good.
everything.
And then we
if they
applaud
make a
that.
mistake, I sometimes think maybe I did something that caused the mistake.
was
You know what I mean?
And so I guess my point is, good parents don't resent their kids. They don't hold grudges against their kids. But when they see their kids having problems and doing wrong, they help them.
Right.
And so that's the thing that Jesus was trying to nuance there on the cross. And this is what Jesus is doing, God is doing in all of our lives. He wants to help all of his created children. He's not interested in forgiving us, because forgiveness is what imperfect people do, if that makes sense. Right. And so
no, it makes total sense.
And so, you know, to suggest that God forgives, number one, is to suggest that he's not perfect. If we go along with the idea of how forgiveness is being spun in, you know, American English. And so I think that there's something to be really, really talked about in the context of forgiveness. And this is so tragic, because I think that actually most people in church think that God, because they have read the Old Testament, they think that God actually resented that he had ever made man. Therefore, he sent this flood and killed everyone but 8 people and all of the animals. And this is quite tragic, and you've already rejected the story in a sense. And right. I applaud that. And so what gave you the confidence to start rejecting much of Scripture?
Well, it's less rejection, you know, is it
your intellectual honesty,
it's a
or
surface
what?
layer rejection.
Okay, good.
You know, I think that there's a story that's underneath that's being told. You know, look at we've got American folklore. You know, Paul Bunyan and his little blue or purple ox or whatever it was. You know, all people, all cultures, they have folklore, they have myths, they have legends, right. And I think that is. I mean, the story of Noah is awfully similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh, all right? So it's almost identical, you know, and there's other deluge-type stories. And I think that, you know, what's important is finding out what that underlying story means. And I mean, my concept is different. You know, you have to look at, you know, the washing away of things. But, you know, I don't think that a lot of that stuff is literal. I mean, I think one could argue that maybe Abraham didn't truly exist, but that the concept of monotheism had to be introduced. And maybe he did, but maybe he didn't. So I think it's less important trying to factually and literally prove the text, and more important to say, well, what's it saying? You know, what's the lesson? And so for me, you know, I don't reject the Bible. I read the Bible every day. You know, I had to buy a new one because I wore my other one out. You know, so yeah, I don't but I don't reject it, you know, outright. I just think that surface layer, for lack of better words, and no offense to people that take it to be literally true, I think that's for the profane, for the ones that you know, that don't understand what the underlying text means, or maybe are they incapable of it. But to me, look, if you believe it, then fine. If you go to church every Sunday and you do your tithing and you leave church feeling good about yourself, great. That's fine. But if you leave church thinking, oh God, I did all these horrible things, I got to go home and pray the rosary, or I got to do this and I got to do that, then no, it's cancer. You shouldn't go, you know. And so I just think that you know, a lot of these things have kind of been, you know, that sola scriptura part where, you know, everything has to be true. I don't think it has to be. I think that it's the story, the message. That's more important.
There is a comment / question that comes from Roy Montalbano. He says, Doc, the discussion is very good, and I agree. I mean, you're doing a wonderful job, Nelson.
Thank you. Nervous as heck in the beginning, but I'm a little more comfortable now.
Good. We want you to get comfortable, and please understand that we love talking, and I think that if we can be willing to come to the table of discussion and discuss forgiveness, atonement, all of these things, I think that we can make some progress and move forward. Now, here's the point that Roy is making. The discussion is very good, but no one is going to read the English Bible translations that we have now and not believe in the blood atonement of Christ.
I don't know about that.
Well, I'm simply saying that he's simply trying to make the point that most people, when they read that, for instance, in Romans chapter 5, you know, you're justified by the blood of Jesus. And so when you start reading blood here and blood there, and you start reading propitiation and atonement here and there, that's normally where people go, especially in Protestantism and Catholicism. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. They go to the blood, they go to the letters of Paul, and they focus on those small subsets of Scripture and avoid the part that talks about, you know, honoring your father and mother and loving your neighbor as yourself and giving up those things that you don't necessarily need for the benefit of other people. Those are the harder things to do. It's easier to say that because of somebody else's blood, everything's okay. But I'd rather go with the harder thing, because it makes the world a better place when you focus on those things. But I think that I think the important thing that people have to think about is that these are letters. People misconstrue the concept that Paul wrote the majority of the New Testament. That's really not true. He wrote the most number of entries, okay? But when it comes to word count, he's not even close, you know? There's Matthew. The entire book of Matthew is longer in text and word count than everything that Paul did put together, all right? So the fact that people focus on those small bits versus the stories that are being told in the parables, I think they're shortchanging themselves. The better good news message that you find in those first, you know, the synoptic gospels especially. John, I think it's a lot. There's commentary woven into the telling of the story, but to me, you know, if you look at the letters as being, you know, hey, Paul had an audience. He was talking to the people at Corinth. He was talking to the people at Ephesus. He was talking to the Thessalonians. He was talking to them about things that they specifically weren't doing right, or things that they specifically were having issues with. And you have to talk in the context of what those people understand. These are people that had multitudes of gods, you know, at the time, the Greeks, you know, you had the pantheon of gods. They had demigods, okay, like Hercules and all that other kind of stuff that were half man, half God, had to do these monumental feats for the sake of everybody else. So you have to put the story in that particular context so that it makes sense. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to use that particular context. And so I kind of think that I give more weight to the Gospels than I do to the epistles. I think it's a better story. Most people, and I've heard this from people that have gone through seminary school, they love the whole thing about Jesus and the Gospels and the stories there. And they kind of get depressed when they start reading the stuff about Paul, you know, because I think it's a different story. I mean, it's the same story, but it's a different way of telling it. And I think that so much emphasis was put on those letters than everything else that's what caused this what we have. There's more to it than just blood atonement. And I think that from a gospel perspective, you really don't see blood atonement. You see a man who was trying to teach, trying to strip down he basically was a follower of Hillel, Rabbi Hillel, and that battle that was going on between Hillel and Shammai during the time before Jesus, and whether Judaism should be about ethics and morals or about animal sacrifices and ritual and Kazrat laws. So you had that battle that was going on, and it's very likely that if you look at the timing, Jesus may have been in the temple when Hillel was there and learning from Hillel, rather than Jesus teaching everybody else. The idea that a 10-year-old could teach, I guess it could happen, but and I think that when people focus just on small subsets of Scripture instead of looking, because what I like to do is, and I go to a church because there's a great one that's nearby, and my kids have friends that go to. But what I like to do is when I listen to what the pastor says, and he gives these bits of Scripture, I come back and I say, okay, he said, Galatians chapter 1, verse 4, or whatever. I read that, but then I read from the beginning of the chapter all the way to the end of the chapter, so that I can get that verse in context. And very often, the verse can be taken out of context, or it's used in a different context. Luckily, the particular church I'm going to now, the pastor is very good about not doing that. But that's not to say that that doesn't happen out there, because it clearly does. And I think that when people read those verses, but then they read before and after, that there's a little less on the blood atonement side. That's just my opinion, but
when you deal with the book of Matthew, for instance, from the Greek text, one of the things that we do have problems with is, and I'm going to speak from the standpoint of what atheists would question, and I do think that they have some valid questions. You have almost as many different authors as you have chapters in the book of Matthew, Mark, and subsequent books of the New Testament. And so the question would be, these books, for instance, like Matthew and Mark, they look like the work of teams of people that are putting together systematic theology, whereas the Apostle Paul, his epistles look and appear to be quite authentic. How would you address that question?
I think it's a valid point. There was no biblical canon from a New Testament perspective until the Constantine decided to get everybody together and make it the religion of the Roman Empire. So the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't come from probably the Q source, which I think is what the concept is now. I think there's a valid argument to that, but again, it goes back to what my initial feelings were. Is what's being taught, I think, is more important. Not necessarily the whole blood sacrifice thing, but the way we're all supposed to act towards one another and love one another. I think that's what's the important part of the story. And everybody focuses on the dogma and the doctrines. You don't have to have a dogma or a doctrine. I don't think that that's necessary. That's simple-minded stuff. I think what you need is those lessons in morality and those lessons in charity. And look at Jesus. I mean, he could have done things completely different, right? He could have come down with the white robes and the gold piping and the crown that glows and nobody could doubt it. And this is no. He sat down with the worst of people, okay, and tried to bring them out of the gutter that we're in. That's what we should all be doing, and I think that was what he was trying to teach.
Sure.
And that part gets erased with the dogma and the doctrines. And I think for atheists, I think that I think there's probably more atheists that actually are accepting of the concept of there probably being an initial and perpetual source of life and love, but they just reject this religion stuff. And that's it's hard to argue that when you look at a lot of the things that have happened and the wars and the atrocities that have been done in the name of God. It makes it difficult for people with a rational and reasonable mind to say, that they have to follow, this particular doctrine or dogma. But yeah, I think that I think it's been well proven already from a literal perspective that these we all know Matthew didn't write Matthew, you know. John Mark wrote Mark, and it was based on his stories from Peter, which probably came from the Q source. Luke never even knew Jesus. How did he write an eyewitness testimony to the man's life when he never even knew him? He wasn't even Jewish, you know. And then you have John, who is probably the one who but clearly injected a lot of evangelism in there. But I don't think it matters. I don't think who wrote it doesn't matter as much as what's being taught.
Okay. Out of curiosity, I want to know your position when it comes to the canon, the canons. We have various canons, but none of the extant canons, that is the existing canons, have been given to us, that is, prove to be actually what God actually said.
Right.
We know that every one of the canons contain what man said God said.
Right.
And should we be rethinking a lot of things based upon what man said God said versus what God actually said? Should we rethink what a canon is, and should we maybe move forward in linguistic science and other areas to actually find at some point in the future maybe what God actually said?
I think that the idea that the sole source should be Bronze Era writings, no, I don't think that that's the only thing, that's the only source of divine inspiration. I think that a person could go on a hike in the mountains in North Carolina and learn more about God than reading the book of Romans, okay? Looking at a waterfall, and watching, the water come down and just continuously flowing, as if it's, never going to run out, which, and it just flows. I think when you inject yourself into that, you learn, about the creation, and you learn, how small you are, but then again how big you are, So yeah, Bronze Era. I'm not a big fan of a sealed canon. I think that God still reveals himself to people even now. I mean, if you look at everything that's in the canon, most of Revelation was done in dreams. It wasn't this voice coming from the clouds. Most of it was dreams, and we all dream. All right, so that little voice that that tells you, hey, don't do that. Maybe it's God. When you're upset, when you're fearful, and you look up and you're like, oh, help me. Who are you talking to? You know what I mean? If you're in a foxhole, like you mentioned your children, and thank your children who are serving, right now. But there's no atheists in foxholes. There just aren't. When the bullets start flying, you're believing that somebody's going to get you out of there. Okay, and if you're in a plane, God forbid, and it's going down, all of a sudden you become pretty religious. So the idea that there isn't anything that's greater that we need to rely on or that we need to put our confidence in, all you got to do is put yourself in one of those situations, and you know that there is. Or look into, like I said, when my child was born, you look into the eyes of a child, and how can you possibly believe that we're just globs of carbon-based molecules that just, because of the right circumstances and the right type of vision, boom, everything just kind of formed? No, I think that's nonsense. But I also think that you are every bit as capable, Dr. Jones, of writing a letter to the people of Philadelphia that is every bit as canonical and every bit as divinely inspired as what Paul wrote to the Ephesians.
I do agree much in every way with what you're saying. Let's move on to another topic, and this is a very important topic, especially for my wife and I. We love each other, and I mean, we look at each other and we just drool over each other in the most magnificent way, and we live for each other, and we love our children, and we have a wonderful family life. And yet at the same time, we see other people struggling to have faithfulness in a relationship, people struggling to have genuine love, And I'm talking about that single eye. In other words, I have absolutely no desire to look at any other woman other than my wife. I mean, she just captures the all of me, and it just arrests me. Would you speak a little bit about your feelings concerning family, your relationship with your wife, and faithfulness, and what it takes to make a good relationship? Many people are struggling in that area.
I'm struggling in that area. As much as I love my kids, and as much as I do love my wife, we've had some rocky road. We've gone through we've gone through separations, almost got divorced. So it's tough. There's been wrong on both sides, and I don't absolve myself of wrongdoing. I screwed up, and I think that I'm not going to say anything bad about my wife because she's a wonderful person, but I think that I envy people that can have that kind of a relationship. I look at it, I'm like, God, and I know it's not right to envy, but I think in that particular case, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want that person that they know they can always count on, that they know that they can always depend on, that they know is never going to let them down? And I think if you get that type of person, you have definitely been blessed. And and I'm happy for people that have that. It's tough. I think especially with all of the vices and opportunities that present themselves through Facebook and instant messaging and Twitter and all that other kind of stuff. It makes it so easy to misbehave, And then we live in a culture that treats relationships and love is almost a joke. You have ridiculous shows like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. And I know I have friends that are out there that are watching this that love that show, but I'm sorry, it's garbage. And I think that the moral fabric of us as a people gets completely ripped to shreds when we allow garbage like that to be on TV. But it's sucked up by people for whatever reason. It's people want to watch that stuff as if it's even real. Pimping yourself out to a bunch of other people so that you can not get married at the end of the season. It's ridiculous. But but at the same time, I am definitely not one to give relationship advice. I'd love it. I love it that couples are that have that, and it's something that I have it, but it's like I said, it's been a rocky, rough road.
Another question has come in from various people. I think that I have just people asking question after question after question.
I bring them.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to get to all of these.
Okay.
One person, her name is Harriet. Do you know Harriet Rose?
Harriet Rose, Mom.
This is my oldest son, Nelson, going on the air.
Yeah.
She says, please tune in. I mean, you can't beat moms, can you?
No, you can't beat moms. I love you, Mom.
There you go.
That's precious.
Another question would be, why would we seek clarity in the parables of which Jesus testified that he used them to keep people actually in the dark? So,
that's that's a good question. And if Jesus could come in my door right now and sit down at the table, I would ask him, why couldn't you just say 1 + 1 = 2? But I think that part of life and part of the process is digging and learning and studying. And so that's, to me, is probably the reason why it was taught in the manner that it was taught, so that it would have a specific, and naturally there's a thread of meaning that's common, I think, for everybody. But I think as the individual reads the story and they read the parable, there should be a story that's going to that particular person, to where a parable may mean something for me, and it may not necessarily mean the same thing for you. And that's where I think the guys in the pulpit do a disservice for people sometimes, where they say, this is what it means. instead of saying, this is what I think it means, and you need to read it and try to kind of inject yourself into the story and come up with what it might mean for you.
Do you think the scripture needs to be taken in this polysemious context?
Yeah. Yeah,
So you do not think that we need to find out what the authors intended? It's better to
Well,
be
no, I
reader
mean,
intended?
how are you going to find out what these guys meant 2,000 years ago?
Well, I'm
You know,
saying that
you know what I mean?
I'm simply suggesting, if it's possible to
Oh, well, yeah.
understand
I mean,
what an author intended, should we try to find out what the author intended, or should we read it and actually eisegete, read ourselves into it? Which is best?
To me, I think it's up to the individual. You know what I mean? I think personally, I think it's enough to inject yourself into the story and personalize it into something that makes you better. But if that means that the only way that you can do that, you have to get in and inject yourself into what the person meant, then hey, then that's what you have to do. And I think ultimately everybody ends up getting to that level if they're really serious about studying it.
Certainly, certainly. Now, we have several atheists who are listening in tonight, and I applaud them. I mean,
I love them.
We have so many atheists who are so kind and honest. And what do you have to say to them that would make sense to them, that they may lean more in a direction of actually believing that God does reveal himself to human beings in some sense of the word? What would you say to them?
I asked them if they ever loved anybody. You know, if they love their children, you know, or if they have love for their parents. You know, there is an obvious, right there, because I think that, I would tell them you don't have to accept doctrines and dogma, to believe in that. But I also think that what, ultimately, science could technically be a religion, because it does require an element of faith in and of itself. We know of DNA because a bunch of scientists told us about DNA. They studied these cells, they looked at this stuff, and they said that this is what it is. But that's what they said. Science has proven things, but we're taking a scientist's word, and it may be a group of scientists. But how is that any different than a group of guys in the Bronze Age that tried to say that this means that and that means that? So I think from an atheist perspective, you don't have to believe in dogmas and doctrines and the skies parting and all that stuff. Go out in the woods, listen to the breeze, take a nap, listen to the dream. I think that when you look at it in that perspective, then it's difficult to say that we're, just globs of carbon with no purpose.
That's powerful. That's powerful. Hey, it's been a pleasure having you tonight, and
thank you.
We can't get to all the questions tonight, but I want you to come back. I've got some things that I would love to discuss with you. You're such a powerful person.
Thank you.
And the thing that I like is your intellectual honesty. You're not willing to pretend and call it faith.
Right.
You're willing to say, this is what I think, and it may be wrong. I'm willing to readjust, and I really do admire that. My wife and I do. We really do admire that about you, Nelson.
Thank you.
And we thank you so much for coming on the show. And,
thank you for having me.
If there's anything that you could leave that would really be a plus point for anyone listening, because lots of people are going through sickness, hardships, everything in the world. What can you give people to bank on?
Sickness and hardship. I think that ultimately what people that are going through those things, they always have to understand and truly believe that one way or another you get through it, and don't give up.
That's good.
I would agree.
That's good.
I would agree.
Well, Nelson, do one other thing for us, and I said that was the last, but I lied. I want you to give us your blog again, that address.
Okay,
And let's
it's,
make sure that people can get there, because I'm sure that people are going to start, many
Right.
more people will start reading your blog. And please send Nelson Rose your comments. Friend him on Facebook. He's a wonderful person. He will chat with you. He will go full circle with you. And you can't beat people like Nelson Rose.
Oh,
And so
thank you very much.
give us this information once again.
Okay, the blog address is www.questforlight.net, and it's the number 4, not the word. www.questforlight.net, and I am on Facebook. It's just look up Nelson Rose. I don't think there's that many of us. Easy to remember if you're a Guns N' Roses fan, that's for sure. And I'll be happy to accept friend requests. And the Quest also has a Facebook page as well. So if you look for the Quest for Light on Facebook, you'll see that there's a page. And sometimes I may think of something that I think is worth sharing, and I just update the status of that page instead of doing a full-blown blog post. And for those people that aren't real big readers, don't worry. I keep my blog posts to write between 600 and 1,000 words, because I think anything more than that is too dizzy to stare at the computer screen for that long.
That's wonderful. Hey, thanks for being with us tonight. And thank you guys for joining us tonight here at the Place for Intellectual Honesty, Spiritual Honesty, and Scriptural Honesty. And I want to make this clear. We do not have guests on to suggest that we agree with everyone's thoughts, and we're not trying to strong arm any of our guests to agree with us or anything like this. This is a place to where we can put things on the table so we can start reasoning out different ideas and philosophies, etc. And so please understand our intent, our heart, and our love for each and every one of you guys. And let's have a good week. May God bless.
Thanks.
Good night.